We are back with Senators Richard Lugar of Indiana and Mark Warner of Virginia. So the notion that this election will, suddenly make it all clear which party the Americans support, I think we all have sort of said this isn't going to happen. So then what happens to this fiscal cliff? What happens to this $8 billion that will be taken out of the economy at the end of the year in tax increases and spending cuts? How's Congress going to deal with that?
Well, essentially, the Congress leadership has decided not to deal with this until after the election, which I think is a mistake fundamentally. But let's say after the election, very quickly we'll have the debt ceiling problem would appear. We have the sequester problem, the money for the armed forces, quite apart from the rest of it, somebody taken away, plus all the end of the Bush tax cuts, which means tax increases for every American. Now you can say, well, all of that could be postponed until 2 months, 3 months, 6 months down the trail.
Romney says if he's elected, he'd rather
that Congress requires the Congress to come to that conclusion. On whatever the election is, there are unlikely to be a 60-vote majority in the Senate, and unless you have a 60-vote majority, and say my way or the highway, you're going to have to deal across the aisles. It would be better to be doing some of that now, picking up the Simpson-Bowles language or various other, the Gang of 6 or 12 or so forth. I would hope that might occur, and I think the American people would be more relieved, and their thoughts about the Congress certainly would be much better.
I imagine you can agree with that. I want to move you on to Syria, just because I know you've been on. If you want to say something before that, feel free. But something that Mitt Romney said recently about the situation in Syria, the United States should work with partners to organize and arm Syrian opposition groups so they can defend themselves. Good idea, bad idea? Let's start with you.
Well, I want to address the economic issue still, that the idea that we're going to continue to punt this problem, which would be almost a European approach. We've watched this slow-motion train wreck take place in Europe because they've not stepped up. I think there is the will in Congress to take the Simpson-Bowles, the Gang of 6, to phase in a $5 trillion over 10-year deficit reduction plan that will raise some revenues, reform our entitlement programs. We have to do it. There will be nothing that would do more to jumpstart our economy and get the $2 trillion in private sector capital off the sidelines investing if we can make those permanent changes. Now in Syria, I just came back from Egypt and Israel, a very dangerous neighborhood at this point. I think we need to continue to ratchet up the pressure on Assad to get that regime out. I think it is different from Libya, though, because there's not the kind of unanimity at the United Nations or around the Arab League to have the kind of military intervention that it seems that Mr. Romney's calling for.
Well, let me read you something, and this came from the Arab League Secretary General yesterday, who said, more audacious steps are needed after the Hula massacre in order to end the bloodshed. So there is even some urgency now coming from the Arab League. Does that help the U.S. make decisions about should we try to work with folks to get some arms into the Syrian opposition brutally crushed?
I think it helps all of us, but I would say specifically we ought to work with the Turks to set up some zones in Turkish territory guarded by Turks that Syrians can retreat to, so-called safe zones. We ought to increase the sanctions on the government of Syria, and the central bank sanctions, as well as all others that people can cooperate in, make economic pressure, try to reinforce the diplomatic trade. In other words, as opposed to dismissing Kofi Annan and the peace people, we ought to try to strengthen the hand so we get some talks going with the Syrian government. The pressure would have to be increased, but I made two suggestions there as to how that might occur, and there might be others.
So they don't have to be military pressure of arming. And I know that you were worried about the presence of al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups.
Well, I'm worried about, we don't really know who makes up the Syrian opposition. Very different than the situation in Libya.
For Libya, though.
Well,
we didn't know
we're
who
now
they were
seeing
either.
some of the arms smuggling take place out of Libya into the Sinai, which affects our ally Israel. I think that we do need to ratchet up the pressure. I think economic sanctions. I think we need to continue to put the pressure on the Russians. Let's face it, Syria is supported dramatically by the Russians, and we need to move the Russians off of that support as well.
Senator Lugar, I've got less than a minute, and I have to ask you what's next for Richard Lugar. After a long, distinguished Senate career, you are one of the president's favorite Republicans, which probably didn't help you in your primary race. Would you consider, if the president is reelected, a position in his administration, say in diplomacy or foreign policy?
No, I think that my role is going to be outside of government. I look forward to opportunities, but I'm not going to really think about it for 3 or 4 months because essentially I've got work to do for 7 months. we've been talking today about what we ought to be doing back and forth across the aisle in the Senate now to help America, the people that I want to serve. So that's where my preoccupation is going to be.
Senator Lugar, Senator Warner, thank you both.
We're going to lose a lot when we lose Dick Lugar. He's the kind of guy we need to see more of in the Senate.
Thank you.
Up next, a dismal jobs report and what it could mean for the election.